So, you're talking about some of these FELOs and incentives, which effectively are oftentimes 25 or maybe 50 with the special source revenue credits.
Correct.
25 or 50%. I can do that math. That doesn't get us to equal on their default before they even lift a finger and do anything. So, how do you overcome that discrepancy? And can you kind of put that in terms of real dollars? So if you're looking at a 10 or 20 year, model, if you're a business, and you don't just look at, well, this year we're going to pay this compared to this. You're looking at the next at least 10 or 20 years. Over a 10 or 20 year model, let's call it our average project in like the $20 to $50 million range. Mm-hmm. What does that mean in terms of dollars over the life of that model?
That's a great question. I have to go back and look at those numbers.
Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this. It's all about predictability and reliability of the numbers. So where we model out to companies and say, we're going to help you in the first 5 years, like you said, give you a staunch credit, a 50% for 5 years. Yeah, that really reduces the net effective rate. Goes from maybe what is the effective rate, what they pay on their property of, 2.5% to 3%, down to maybe 1.5%, maybe. But the problem is North Carolina and Charlotte, for instance, is paying under 1% effective rate. Yeah. So when they put their coupon on, which they do, they have grants. They have a reimbursement grant program for 5 years, maybe 10 years in some of the counties up there. They're basically giving away the taxes. Yeah. Absolutely. We've done the calculation comparison. Now what happens though is when those grants roll off, they bump up the taxes, right? It goes back to the regular taxes, and those rates have increased over time. Mm-hmm. So it really does help us in that we keep our growth rate in our taxes no to slow, let's say, because we have a program where we can either lock in the millage rate so it doesn't change at all, and they just know their predicted payment every year for 30 years, let's say, or it's adjusted every 5 years. And that's just an average looking back prior year. It slows the roll of the tax increase. We've been typically doing those more often, probably in the last 2 years, every one of them, because there's a feeling, and I agree with this, is that let's support our schools. Right. The bulk of our tax millage rate, as you know, is in our school millage.
It's like 65%?
Yeah, right around there. So it makes sense, but also we have to do it and maintain our competitiveness.
Right. And that's such a difficult balance because obviously one of the points of economic development, you mentioned the jobs, but the other side of it is the tax revenue. I mean, you want the project because you want the tax revenue. It takes the burden off of the rooftops. Absolutely. But you don't get any net new money without offering some type of incentive and doing the hard work to actually get it. Yeah. So I had this conversation with someone the other day, and it dawned on me. I remember, when, I was getting married and, shopping for rings, and someone told me, they were like, don't worry about the price because that's not the actual price. It's like, and it dawned on me that in a way, like South Carolina is kind of like the jewelry store that marks the price way up just so they can say they're giving it to you for 50% off. Yeah. And that really becomes the normal effective rate. And that no one that you're actually landing is going to pay full retail, because if you land them, they're just not going to. Like that's just not the way it works.
In a perfect world, we'd have everything set at a price. You didn't have to negotiate. But there's a commerce clause in the United States Constitution that says companies have the right to maximize profit, earn profit. There's also the state rights that talk about how they can set their costs of operation, taxation, that being. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to play, call it a game, call it a process, whatever you want to call it. We have to go through that effort because we're looking out for our citizens. We're looking out to maximize the benefits that companies bring. And remember, they bring it because they see value in us. They see good, maybe schools, workforce that has a cost. Yeah. They're not shy about paying it. They just want to pay their fair share or get that coupon and a discount because they know they can ask for it. Our legislature allows for it. Our local communities allow for it. We're selective to a degree. We know what good projects are. We've landed a lot of them. We will continue to land a lot of them. We want to maximize more. I would say this, though. The idea of incentive, there is tax incentive. That's what we focused on here. There are other elements to incenting communities, like we're taking care of our green space.
Mm-hmm.
We're putting in parks and recreation, trails and things.
Mm-hmm.
We have good road system. Things that we do that are sort of the tangible and intangibles outside of tax incentive are incentives.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to ever lose sight of that. I know community officials or citizens will sometimes say, why do you give those companies, big companies, incentives? They don't need it. We have great quality of life here. They should just come. They should be knocking on our door. Well, they knock, but there's also the competitiveness nature that we live in.
Yeah. So in other words, it's only everything. You've got to have all those things. How do you win? You have to have everything.
Exactly.
And, we are very, thankfully, there's economic growth within this country, and, people are building, new manufacturing facilities all over the place, but it is very competitive, and each of these companies can spend the money to put it wherever they want.
Yep.
And if you want to win those projects with any degree of consistency, you really have to just be great at all of those things. You've got to have the quality of life. You've got to have the schools. You've got to have the infrastructure. You've got to have the proximity to the airport. You got to have the workforce. You have to have the workforce training and not just the whole labor shed.
Absolutely.
I mean, you've got to have every piece of the pie as well as be competitive in your tax rate.
Yeah.
So in other words, it feels like it has to be overwhelming because economic development is really everything. I mean, if it's parks, if it's infrastructure, someone like you in your position really has to keep their finger on the pulse of all that, just so you can, to have those conversations with any confidence with companies that are reaching out to you, I suppose.
Absolutely. And two things to stress on that. One, we are competing in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So where we had a lot of our industry in South Carolina, we know this for a fact, textiles went overseas. Mm-hmm. Woodworking, cabinetry stuff went overseas, right? Now, what set that off, right? Well, it's more about the market said we want lower cost goods. We didn't care about it made in the U.S. We do now, but we didn't back in the 80s and the 70s, maybe in the 90s there, where just like, all right, it's just going overseas. Look at that plant closed. We saw that firsthand here. That's an economic national policy decision. You bring in what we just did in the last 4 to 6 years under Trump, where we called a spade, and we said, listen, no, it's detrimental to us if we ship everything over to China, made overseas. We need to bring it back here.
Yeah.
Make America great again, right? I can agree with that because the products, they may have a little bit higher costs because of labor or some of the other inputs to that cost of that product, but to make it here has other trade-offs.
Yeah.
So that's an economic policy that I think we got to look closer at in economic development. Doesn't mean though that we don't still have trade. Trade is huge. We need to have things made over in Europe that get bought over here and vice versa. That's just good relationship building and good for our world economy. But the other thing that I think you stressed on, and I take this serious in that it's not all on my shoulders. It's not all on my team's shoulders. It's not on our community leaders' shoulders. It's on everybody's shoulders to do their part to make our community good. Where if we have a homeless issue now, we all need to recognize it and do something about it.
Yeah.
If we have a crime issue or problems in our schools, it's all our responsibilities to do it. And that's not to say we need to implement socialism, communism. No, it's about being responsible as citizens in our community that say,
without relying on government, just individual decision making.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, government is an arm that can do certain things, has responsibility to do certain things, just as business in the market does too. Combine the two, public and private partnerships. Hey, man, it works. It can work.